Prince William and Princess Catherine entered the stage with quivering elegance and eyes full of unsaid truths in a moment that shook Buckingham Palace and beyond. "We can't hide this anymore," Catherine declared. 7 words that destroyed the myth of royal perfection. However, what were they concealing? And why now? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve deeper into what this actually implies for the royal family. The announcement came without notice. No leaks, no briefing in the palace, no planned headlines. There was only one startling alert that a live royal emergency statement would be made. The world paused. The phones rang. Newsrooms froze. When William and Catherine appeared, hand in hand, faces drained, yet determined. Everyone was holding their breath. This wasn't a royal engagement. This was a confrontation. Catherine's voice, though calm, shook at the edges. Her remarks broke through decades of regal formality. The picture of the calm duchess had vanished, to be replaced by a lady worn out by quiet. "We've sheltered something for too long," she remarked, "but it's no longer just about us." The nation's fairy story was breaking in real time. Unusually silent, William stood next to her. His hand never left Catherine's back, a show of support or a silent admission of guilt. His tight stance and the flare in his eyes when Catherine pronounced specific words were noticed by others. Was he surprised at how much she would divulge, or had they finally achieved an agreement? The limit of their endurance. What followed was silence, not from the pair, but from the palace. Immediately after the broadcast, all official royal social media accounts went black. Press liaisons refused to comment. The customary inner circle was closed off to journalists. An announcement that had begun swiftly turned into a major crisis. Public reaction was quick and mixed. Online forums were inundated with comments praising Catherine as courageous and the next, Diana. Others speculated wildly. Was it a health issue? Betrayal? Abdication? Had William done something? Had the crown pushed them too far? The mystery generated a media firestorm. But there was one terrifying insight hidden underlying all the theories. The royal family had lost control of the narrative. This wasn't just a personal concern. This was the breakdown of an institution, playing out in slow, painful action. The moment Catherine spoke those words, the first domino fell. Years, probably decades, of carefully maintained silence were beginning to unravel. And beneath that collapse came a story far more horrific than anyone was prepared for. But in order to comprehend what they were no longer able to conceal, we have to go back to the time when the secret started spreading behind the royal walls, where silence is survival and truth is a liability. Behind every outward grin was a secret chipping away at the core of the Wales marriage, an invisible weight. That grew heavier with every public appearance. Catherine, the picture of composure. William, the air under pressure. But behind the surface, something was shattering. In the meticulously polished realm of royal optics, the smallest deviance becomes a national scandal. And Catherine's modest omissions from key events did not go unnoticed. At first, they were dismissed as scheduling issues, private commitments, or minor health concerns. Whispers started to circulate, though, when those absences continued from one event to another and then repeated over several months. Events she formerly championed, children's hospitals, women's health summits, early childhood campaigns, she quietly withdrew from, without explanation. The palace, tight-lipped as ever, fed the people hollow statements, but something didn't add up. Then came the whisper network. Insiders and aides, whispering behind closed doors, thought they were safe, but they weren't. One slip, one microphone left active at a press prep, and suddenly the world caught wind of the phrase, "She's not coping well at all." It was too late when the palace hurried to deny. The damage was done. The letters began to flow as the appearance of stability began to crumble. Months' worth of handwritten notes showed the psychological decline of a woman imprisoned in a golden cage. In one, Catherine wrote, "I feel like I'm disappearing, and no one notices except the children. They want me silent," is another more eerie line. "They want me to be flawless, but I'm no longer either." The source of the leak was never discovered, although conjecture pointed inward, either a royal aide with a conscience or a desperate family member appealing for help. William, meanwhile, had begun drawing away. Not from Catherine, but from those closest to the crown. He canceled meetings with Charles. He battled with Camilla behind closed doors. Their once public warmth had cooled. In public, they smiled. In private, they disagreed bitterly. William's displeasure was mounting, especially with what he described to one close friend as the culture of deception. While the public still clung to the illusion of a united royal family, inside the palace, Catherine was sliding through the cracks. Late-night visits to London's private clinics became routine, all under aliases. She donned disguises. She made a cash payment. Not even her most senior aides knew the full reality of where she was headed or why. Only William knew, and he wasn't talking. What Catherine was confronting was more than physical. It was emotional, psychological. The urge to maintain perfection while suppressing anguish has become a quiet fight. What about the palace? It didn't blink. As long as the image stayed intact, everything else was collateral. Catherine, long the monarchy's brightest star, was waning within the walls of Kensington. And yet, no royal training, no media coaching, no lineage of survival could prepare them for what came next. Because hidden behind Catherine's absences, her quiet, her shattered soul, was a truth far darker than anybody had dared to contemplate. As fissures emerged in their formerly pristine image, palace insiders were already preparing for a reckoning. One event began with the surfacing of a dreadful diagnosis. It wasn't scandal that dogged them, it was sickness. Catherine fought a disease that was kept a secret from the public for several months. Few, however, were fully aware of the truth, even within the palace. The future queen was fighting for her life and for her silence. Carefully crafted remarks were released by the royal press office. Catherine will be taking time away from royal duties owing to a personal problem. Just enough to put an end to rumors, nothing more. But behind closed doors, there was no misunderstanding. Doctors whispered the name of an autoimmune disorder, one that slowly, cruelly erodes the body's strength and over time breaks the spirit. For Catherine, this was more than a diagnosis, it was a countdown. Additionally, it was an impending PR catastrophe for the monarchy. Shielding their children from the truth became a full-time mission. George, Charlotte, and Louis were told their mother was fatigued, that she required extra rest. But youngsters sense more than they're told. They observed the drawn face, the missed school pickups, the unexpected crying behind shut doors. Catherine, even in her darkest moments, adhered to the concept that their innocence must be safeguarded at all costs. It was her most agonizing performance yet. Behind the scenes, William, who was usually calm in public, started to break. His tempers shortened. His patience waned. At one instance, he reportedly walked out of a senior royal briefing mid-sentence, slamming the door behind him. Insiders said that he wasn't just fatigued, he was disintegrating. He allegedly muttered, "They think it's a story," while pacing the palace hallways at night, according to one source. They don't see her. William didn't fear the press for the first time in his life. He was scared of the stillness among his own family. The palace, determined to keep control, undertook a discreet campaign to quell the increasing murmurs. Non-disclosure extensions were used as a threat against staff. Overly in-depth journalists were excluded from future events. One site, known for its pro-royal coverage, was mysteriously removed off the rota after hinting at Catherine's illness. In the view of the firm, the truth wasn't simply risky, it was treason. However, The truth tends to seep through one file, one digital trace, one breach. A secret medical paper leaked first on a fringe forum, then on encrypted journalist networks. It contained a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and a warning from Catherine's physician about the emotional consequences of prolonged concealment. It was real, and it was irreversible. The palace became a state of hysteria. Legal teams were mobilized. Cybersecurity professionals traced IP addresses across continents. But it was too late. The public knew. And Catherine, with quiet dignity, took a decision that would signal the turning point in her life. She would no longer hide behind silence. Her affliction, her actuality, would no longer be a palace secret. Not for her, not for her children, and not for a monarchy that expected perfection in exchange for misery. This wasn't about optics anymore. It was about survival. But the secret was more than half illness. The other half was significantly more politically volatile and personally personal. While Catherine fought for her health, she learned something that left her more wounded than any diagnosis could. A betrayal from inside a royal deception that questioned all she thought about her marriage, her rank, and her role in the kingdom. Whispers, strange absences, and discussions behind closed doors were the first signs, but it was evidence, not rumors, that made Catherine's heart race. A spate of intercepted communications between William and a senior royal whose name is carefully redacted from all leaked transcripts. The signals were clinical, coded, and terrifying. They talked about optics transition, future reconfiguration, and, most damning of all, managing Catherine's role. Not her health, not her recovery. She played the part of an impediment to be overcome rather than a woman to be shielded. It was hard to ignore the ramifications. Somewhere behind the very walls that had watched her ascend from commoner to future queen, a scheme was unfolding, one that moved the pieces around her like a chessboard. And at the center of it, William, the guy she trusted, the man she had stood alongside through every public success and private grief. Was he a pawn or a player? What ensued was not a confrontation. It was an eruption. Catherine, terrified but resolved, challenged William behind closed doors. The talk was captured not by her, but by a security system that had been recently installed. Purportedly on Charles's orders, that recording was never meant for public ears, but what it caught was raw, poisonous, and irreversible. Catherine's voice shivering with betrayal. William's, quiet but defensive. He never refuted the communications. He just said, "You don't comprehend what's at stake." But she did. She understood all too well. The hand of Charles was evident. Rumors of a discreet transfer had been rumbling for months. The monarch's health, his diminishing grasp, his fixation with keeping the monarchy in these forces had quickened plans. It was not intended to be known to Catherine. Plans to sideline her, ease her out of public life, and redefine the royal narrative around William alone. And then there was Camilla, always watching, always calculating. Sources believe she attended important strategic sessions under the cover of health briefings, that she gradually nourished concerns about Catherine's illness, twisting it into a justification to maintain the family image. Behind her smile was a steely campaign of control. If Catherine vanished from view, Camilla's position merely solidified. It was palace politics at its most savage. The harm to the Wales marriage was catastrophic. For the first time since their wedding, Catherine moved out of their shared lodgings for a whole week. William canceled engagements, claiming personal issues. Aides were advised to keep their distance. Silence was what the public witnessed. What they didn't see was a couple on the edge of breakdown. Catherine had weathered media storms, health challenges, and royal scrutiny. However, this was not like the others. This was treachery, not from the outside world, but from the very institution she had dedicated her life to. And then, the recordings. The ones that, until they leaked, were never intended for the whole public to hear. When secret audio recordings appeared on an unknown site, the world heard what the palace feared most: the sound of a princess sobbing, a prince ripped in two, and a system that enforced silence over truth. The story was no longer under the monarchy's authority. The spill was harsh, rapid, and untraceable. The audio was incredibly intimate, raw, and uncensored. In one of the earliest clips to emerge, Catherine's voice could be heard in a whispered phone call to her mother. Her tone was one of fear rather than strength. "I'm not secure here anymore," she whispered, followed by a long pause and the sound of a soft sob. The stillness that followed was heavier than words. It didn't sound like a future queen. It sounded like a woman imprisoned by formality, asking to be seen. And then came William. In another audio, apparently obtained during a private discussion at Highgrove, his voice was low, filled with mixed frustration. "He wants me to take the crown without her. It wasn't a slip. It was a confession, one that broke the remaining shreds of the royal fairy tale." It was an obvious suggestion. Charles, under pressure, was planning for a succession bypass that excluded Catherine totally. The fallout was swift and nuclear. Within hours, the palace issued a statement denying the validity of the audio, calling them doctored, false, and slanderous. But no amount of royal spin could put the genie back in the bottle. The emotion seemed too genuine to be fake, and the voices were clear. And the public? They weren't buying the denials. What ensued was something the monarchy hadn't planned for: popular insurrection. A viral campaign using the hashtag #ProtectCatherine swamped social media channels. Millions united behind her, demanding responsibility. Major news outlets, long loyal to the palace, began exposing talks about abuse of power, mental health incompetence, and institutional betrayal. The royal family's grip on the narrative was eroding. Catherine, already weakened by illness and treachery, took the most excruciating decision yet. She withdrew from royal duties, from public engagements, from the limelight that had both enhanced and diminished her. There was no last wave, no farewell statement, just a vanishing act that left the nation shocked. The speech from the palace balcony was drowned out by the future queen's silence. And in the turmoil, one name slipped missing from the royal calendar altogether. Camilla, the queen consort, once omnipresent beside Charles, was suddenly absent. No public sightings, no scheduled appearances, no explanation. Some termed it strategy. Others suspected something considerably more sinister: a forced withdrawal while internal fires were put out. The timing was not a coincidence, was not a coincidence for whatever reason. The monarchy was burning from within, and the smoke was no longer containable. As the palace struggled to stop the leaks, the public turned their attention towards someone who had always stood with them, in the shadows till now. Known as the Iron Woman of the Royal, Princess Anne has always been the monarchy's last line of defense. But when she moved forward, it wasn't to guard the crown, it was to protect Catherine. Generations of royal allegiance were broken by what she disclosed. The pivotal moment arrived discreetly and without fanfare. A helicopter landed on Balmoral's private property, and out of it came a surprise. Catherine, who was pallid, emotionally spent, and unsure of whom to trust, was waiting inside. The two women discussed for hours, away from attendants, away from listening ears. What was exchanged in that room would become the impetus for Anne's most defiant chapter. One person close to the family said it best: Anne didn't walk into that meeting as the Queen's daughter, she walked in as a sister. Days later, Anne walked in front of reporters outside St. T. Mary's Chapel. Her words were short, but their weight reverberated over the kingdom. "Some truths must come out, no matter the cost," she remarked. It wasn't a statement, it was a challenge. The kind that couldn't be walked back. And she knew it. Then came the clearest indicator that something was severely broken within the royal fold. And for the first time in decades, she refused to stand alongside Camilla at a high-profile engagement. There was no explanation. However, royal observers quickly came to their own conclusions. Behind the scenes, the rift was clear. Anne had drawn her line, and Camilla stood firmly on the other side of it. Soon after, a scanned handwritten note that ended up in the inboxes of two independent journalists was leaked, not to the tabloids or through unnamed sources. Her farewell words at a private foundation event would echo louder than any royal pronouncement. What happened to Diana? Won't happen again. But if Anne was the protector, then the following twist demonstrated exactly how far the monarchy was ready to go to bury the truth. Emails removed, phones tapped, tales were planted. What ensued was not an investigation. It was an operation. Catherine, once their crown jewel, was now the greatest danger to the existence of the monarchy, and the palace had gone into full damage control mode. The campaign started quietly, almost unnoticeably. Anonymous royal sources began whispering to favored tabloids about Catherine's emotional volatility. She was portrayed as unstable, unpredictable, delicate. Concern for her welfare, pausing to think, using coded language, and struggling behind the scenes were all mentioned in the headlines. But it wasn't concern. It was character assassination. It was also effective. Opinion began to shift. Doubt seeped in. The palace, desperate to recover control, had chosen a hazardous approach to destroy from inside. But they didn't stop at words. Surveillance footage was presented to a royal court in a startling legal document that claimed Catherine had a breakdown on the grounds of the palace. The video, however, was shortly identified as doctored. Timestamps didn't match. Reflections in glass revealed discrepancies. Under duress, the palace removed the video, but the harm was already done. The implication had already been planted. Catherine was being framed. Then came the attacks on her family. Middleton relatives, formerly admired for their prudence, were now accused of leaking information, profiteering off their royal link, and interfering with internal concerns. Private photographs appeared in low-tier outlets. Financial records were released without any background information. However, the media wasn't the only force behind the smear campaign. It was palace-approved press pals. Following directions whispered from gilded offices, Catherine had lost her status as a royal spouse. She was the system's enemy, and yet, in the middle of the turmoil, someone slipped. A royal communications staffer, young, ambitious, and reckless, was caught delivering bogus storylines directly to the press. Emails were tracked down, payments were uncovered. The staffer was removed quietly, but the trail they left behind was explosive. It indicated an intentional effort to characterize Catherine as mentally unfit, emotionally unstable, and politically insignificant. But if the monarchs expected she would retreat, they had miscalculated. Because Catherine wasn't backing down, she answered with a legal countersuit, so exact, so devastating, it sent shockwaves through the palace. Citing defamation, emotional damage, and improper surveillance, the lawsuit targeted particular agencies of the Royal Media Office. It wasn't just a defensive maneuver, it was war. A senior royal had used the court system against the same organization she was supposed to represent for the first time in contemporary royal history. Meanwhile, murmurs began to seep farther into the state. There were rumors that the palace press office's internal communications were being monitored by MI5, Britain's most covert intelligence agency. The danger was now internal collapse rather than external threats. The monarchy wasn't simply under scrutiny, it was under threat from within. And Catherine? She was no longer hidden, no longer waiting, no longer allowing herself to be rewritten by people who previously labeled her the future. But just when the palace felt they could limit the fallout, Catherine and William did something that no one expected. They told the world it was going to be a soft interview. Instead, it became a seismic royal event. Sitting side by side, William and Catherine stared into the camera and whispered words no future rulers had ever dared pronounce. This is no longer something we can conceal. And what came next astonished the globe. It was a serene scene. The tone was kind. However, the words, they shook the very core of the monarchy, Catherine said, her voice gentle but steadfast. She began by talking about the nights of fear, her illness, the years of silence, the pressure to smile when all she wanted to do was scream. She spoke of being warned, the crown doesn't wait for suffering, and how every move she took for her health was treated as a political risk, not a human requirement. I was expected to be perfect while breaking, she added, and in that moment, the world saw the truth behind the headlines. Then William said, his admission was raw and unexpected. I made mistakes. I let individuals in authority tell me that distance would protect us. However, it only cost us time we won't get back. His eyes never left Catherine's. The unspoken weight between them conveyed more than the planned sentences ever could. He didn't just concede faults, he acknowledged complicity. And that, more than anything, reshaped his image in the eyes of a waiting nation. But this wasn't just about the past. Together they made a pledge, one that went well beyond any PR strategy or media rehabilitation attempt. Catherine said, "We will not raise our children in fear and secrecy. They won't receive a crown drenched in silence from us. The monarchy must evolve, or it will not survive," William said, nodding. Tradition broke under the pressure of conscience with those words. And then came the blow. The castle never saw coming. Catherine looked directly to the interviewer and remarked, "This system favors silence. We chose truth." It wasn't just a criticism. It was an independence proclamation, a line in the sand between duty and dignity, between identity and image. The message was plain. If the crown demanded sacrifice, they would no longer offer themselves up. What ensued was nothing short of a cultural earthquake. Public support swelled to levels unseen since the days of Diana. Former detractors reversed direction. Prominent media figures issued apologies. Editorials across the globe hailed the couple's courage, honesty, and refusal to be puppets of an outmoded institution. The monarchy had long considered untouchable, but suddenly it was being questioned not by the public, but by its future king and queen. Behind the scenes, Buckingham Palace went into full crisis gear. Emergency meetings were held with Parliament, senior aides were summoned, the Prime Minister was apparently briefed within hours of the telecast ending. For the first time in almost a century, there were whispers not of scandal, but of fundamental reform. The institution could no longer pretend everything was under control. William and Catherine had exploded a truth bomb, and there was no going back. However, the confession served as a motivator, rather than merely a conclusion. What occurred next would reshape the entire future of the British monarchy. Not only did the confession end the silence, but it also disrupted the system. As Charles's grip weakened and the public's devotion fragmented, the House of Windsor found itself standing at a crossroads, change or fall apart. And in the heart of it all stood a pair who refused to hide anymore. Within hours following the televised interview, social media ignited. But this time, it was momentum rather than rage. Hashtags urging abdication for King Charles soared across platforms. Polls showed a staggering shift. A majority of the British population now agreed it was time for a shift. Not eventually, but now. Not a ceremonial handover, a reckoning. The image of Charles as a stable monarch had disintegrated, and all that was left was a hollow, silence-tarnished figure clutching to a throne. Then came Camilla's vanishing act. No royal engagements, no formal statement, just absence. For weeks, Whispers swirled of her being quietly moved to Sandringham under the guise of health and privacy. But palace insiders knew better. This had nothing to do with becoming better. This was about optics, removing the most contentious character from the public view, while the corporation recalibrated. Discretion is a cover for damage control. Behind the scenes, an unusual event was taking place. For the first time in almost a century, Parliament started closed-door deliberations concerning constitutional amendments around the monarchy. The idea had once been unfathomable, untouchable. But following the confession, the old norms no longer stood. Questions were being asked in the halls of power. Could a monarch be forced to abdicate? Could the line of succession be influenced by public demand? The answers were unclear, but the debate itself signaled an era of instability. And while the institution scrambled, William altered. No longer the passive heir waiting for his turn, he emerged as a voice for reform, for modernity, for truth. He talked in schools, he met with veterans, he shook hands with his detractors, and through it all, he repeated one sentence again and again. The crown must serve, not silence. The public began to recognize not just a future king, but a different kind of ruler. Catherine's return was equally powerful. She returned with a presence that was stronger, quieter, and shamelessly transformed rather than with glitz and pomp. Her sickness is now a shared testament to survival rather than a humiliating secret. She met with patients. She spoke with mental health advocates. She didn't act as though everything had been resolved. She demonstrated that recovery was achievable, and in doing so, she reimagined what monarchy could look like in a new age. Then came the letter, delivered by Catherine at a children's hospice fundraiser, but written from a place of grief and hope, her voice quiver as she read it aloud. We were instructed to defend the crown at any costs, but what happens when the cost is our children's innocence, our own humanity? We went in a different direction. For our children, we picked brightness. The room exploded in applause. But across the country, the message reverberated deeper. William and Catherine were no longer the subject of this. It was about a dysfunctional system exposed by the same individuals it intended to eliminate. Because in the end, the biggest threat to the throne was the truth it buried. I appreciate you watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you at the next one.